And then I stand up and I've been at the bar for 3 months and I end up arguing against a silk who took silk before I was born. And I was acting for the Guptas at that stage, actually. I, for example, get called an EFF lawyer. And that actually impacts how I get work or don't get work. It was only when the white senior counsel endorsed me as someone of merit did the attitude change slightly. A lot of black lawyers end up taking the cases that they do because that's the only work they get.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. And today I'm delighted to be joined by one of South Africa's most incisive and prominent advocates. Someone who is a Rhodes Scholar, someone who has a fascinating journey to the pinnacle of the legal practice. Advocate Kameel Premhid. Welcome to SMWX.
Gosh, thank you. That's quite the introduction, Cesar. No pressure or anything, or false advertising.
Well, the check is in the mail.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Firstly, declare a conflict as we've known each other for a long time, actually.
As we discovered, we've known each other since 2006 when we were both still at school.
You beat me in a debating competition, which I'm afraid is a grave sin.
I did, and I'm hoping you won't exact your revenge now.
No, don't worry. We're ready. This is going to be like that White House meeting with Ramaphosa. Somebody turn off the lights.
Oh, right. Gosh, I don't have my billionaire here to support me there.
Yeah, exactly. Or a golfer.
Oh.
Yes, but so we met briefly at a school debating competition.
Correct.
And you've gone on to do great things in the law. And I'm interested because in our exchange before this, you alluded to your early life, your passion for the law, but the fact that you did not come from wealth and your rise in the law is not down to family networks. Talk us through your journey.
Well, that's right. And I think why I hold on to that and tell that story at every opportunity that I can is because I don't think there's anything exceptional about me. And I think if someone like me with my background can make something of a success of themselves in the profession, then other people can too. But the long and the short of it is my family are an Indian family from Durban who experienced the vicissitudes of apartheid, and through the Group Areas Act, my mother and father were from different parts of Durban and ended up with their families being relocated into the same street. And that's how they met. And so that's my family background. And, my mother, I think, wanted to be an advocate, but because she didn't come from a family of means, she could only become a teacher because that was substituted for her to study. And so I became aware of what an advocate was very early on, but I didn't know whether I was going to go into politics first and then the law, or whether I was going to do it the other way around. And so my mother, who was a single mom who brought me up, worked very hard. She worked 3 jobs at some point to keep us going. And I was a scholarship boy. And so I won scholarships to go to the types of schools that if I didn't, win those scholarships, I don't think we would have afforded to let me go there. And through a lot of hard work, sometimes at great personal sacrifice and expense, I got through school. I then got to university. At university, which was UKZN, I worked very hard there as well and did moderately okay, and then applied for the Rhodes Scholarship and got it.
Yeah.
And then that's how we met for the second time.
That's how we met for the second time.
Yeah.
And for those who don't know, the Rhodes Scholarship process is extremely competitive. You have to do very well academically, but you also have to do well in other fields. And you won that scholarship. That must have been quite an incredible moment personally, but also for your family at the time, I suppose.
Absolutely. In as much as some members of my family have gone on to university, so I wasn't the first one to go to university. I was definitely the first one to go to an international university. So that was a huge moment for my family. for me too, obviously, but I still think that they're going to call me someday and say, we made a mistake, please give our scholarship back. And I don't know whether that's a false sense of humility or imposter syndrome that has followed me for much of my life. But I mean, it's about intellect, leadership, service and dedication. And I managed to convince a panel I had those qualities in sufficient quantity to give me the scholarship.
I still think the panel is also going to call me to say they made a mistake, but for another reason.
Yeah, well, in your case, I think that the history bears that out, that they might have made such a mistake.
Indeed.
Probably with me too, but for different reasons.
I doubt that. But then, as you say, the Rhodes Scholarship is to go to Oxford, and we actually met there.
Yep.
What were your experiences of Oxford? Because, interestingly, we didn't really know each other very well.
No.
But I mean, we definitely coincided, but I'm now interested because I feel I do know you better, how you enjoyed your time at Oxford and what your experiences were there.
I mean, Oxford is an amazing place, probably a bit too amazing at times, in considering what my marks reflected over that 2-year stint. But by ancient history.
Exactly. I think we had opposite academic trajectories. You had a stellar career, and then you were like, now I can relax. And I was like, okay, I need to start getting good because the early stuff was a bit, shall we say, less than stellar.
I don't want to say that I took Oxford as my 2-year paid holiday, but it was definitely an enjoyable experience. I mean, for me, I think what was amazing about Oxford, and you might have a similar view. But I thought that it was an intellectually incredibly stimulating environment, not necessarily better or worse than universities back home, but just the breadth of people that you met from, and the interdisciplinary nature of the place meant it was intellectually stimulating. Of course, it was also very socially stimulating. It was at Oxford when I officially and formally came out as a gay man, after having had a relationship with a man before, but, not very publicly, and then also having had a relationship with a woman as well. And that was more public. So Oxford was wonderful for me because it also I think it was a place where I felt incredibly safe to be the person that I was at the time and who I've subsequently grown from. And it was a magical place. And every time I go back, I relive the glory days, but not actually, because my liver is not strong enough anymore.
It was a time of great social, intellectual exploration and feeling as if you were being tested intellectually. And I just remember, you probably have similar moments, but when you first get there, and then there's usually like we're going to go around and you have to introduce yourself to your classmates or something like that. And just everyone's like, yes, MIT, Harvard, Cambridge. And you're like, yes, University of Cape Town. And like, you feel like you're starting at something of a deficit. But there's a moment where you're like, wait a second, these are not like super geniuses.
That's right.
I'm not necessarily smarter than everyone here, but I'm not necessarily like not meant to be here.
That's right.
Maybe. And that's quite an important moment of self-actualization.
Oh, I totally agree with you. I mean, just let's think about it from the South African context. At least UCT, in terms of the rankings, is well regarded, and does very well. I mean, UKZN does adequately, but nowhere near as well as UCT. So, I mean, imagine, I say to someone, I come from UKZN, the University of KwaZulu-Natal. They look at me like I'm speaking another language, But I fully agree with you. And I think what I actually came to appreciate during our time there is that even though these fellow students of ours or academics that we interacted with or people that we crossed paths with did have these incredible academic pedigrees from these remarkable institutions, a lot of them were actually quite ignorant. And I found that very often I could speak to Americans, for example, or Brits as well, and I could speak to them about politics in their country in a way that they just were unable to do so. And they certainly couldn't talk about South Africa in that way. So I thought that was quite interesting. I think that made me very proud actually to be a South African because of how, we position ourselves in the world.
I don't know if you remember this, but Nelson Mandela died when we were in Oxford.
Yes.
And it was such an interesting moment to be a South African abroad, because you were like looking for any South African you could
absolutely.
find, and just like trying to, and I particularly remember that moment, like seeing you. We didn't know each other very well, but we both had to be like, wow, Mandela's gone. Like, I'm sorry. Sorry for you. And yeah, it was a fascinating moment.
Well, it's like the look that all people of color give each other when they're the only people of color in the room,
especially
among a sea of white. Well, exactly.
Yeah. In Oxford, you have the solidarity.
Exactly.
Like,
exactly. But I remember that very well because Rhodes House had a very hastily put together memorial. And I remember a lot of the South African scholars came through, but a lot of other people, who wanted to show solidarity. And I just remember that being so incredibly sad. And I never thought that the country, Mandela dying was something we all knew would come. And I think people in some quarters overestimated the impact that would have.
Yeah.
And I don't think I necessarily shared that view, but it was the passing of a moment. It was the passing of the flame. And I thought to myself, what next? And then... history unfolded. Richard McClaverty, whom you probably know, we got on a bus and went down to the South African High Commission, actually. And I think we signed a book of condolence there. And I remember on the way back, I bought every newspaper I could, because each one of those newspapers had Nelson Mandela on the front cover. And it was it's an interesting experience about being away, but also wanting to be home and experiencing that connection at a distance. It's something I'll hold on to for the rest of my life, actually.
Yeah. One last thing about the Oxford experience. I don't know if you had an interest, a similar perspective. And a lot of people who I meet who watch the channel are interested in studying abroad, and I really
apply.
Absolutely. And there's a dearth of advice and just experiences of people who've been to these places. As you say, the people who were there were no smarter than those I met at UCT, for example. But the difference for me was the floor was much higher.
Yeah.
So everyone was as smart as like the smart people. And then you're like, wow, okay, so the standard has been raised so high that now excellence is the norm.
Correct.
And that leaves a mark on you in Oxford, but also in later life, because you have an idea of what excellence means for you, how you reach that, and how you have to kind of transcend the limits of what you thought was possible for you to get to that standard.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's an incredibly astute observation, and it's one that I fully agree with. And I think from what you're saying, I can identify that quality that you're talking about, because, it's an inherently competitive place because, all the people who are there are looking to become, investment bankers or prime minister or a Nobel winning scientist or something after that. And so the competition is tough. And I think what it did give me, at least coming back from that, is it gave me essay crisis writing skills. So the ability to produce, decent quality or good quality work every week on deadline. It also, I think, developed my ability to engage in a way that, as you would know from the tutorial type of setup, where it's not good enough just to have an opinion. You have to then answer the why, so what, therefore, and so on. And so I thought that was a great skill. And the other thing that it gave me is it did very much give me a sense of drive, because I think it lifted my gaze as to a new horizon. Yeah. And I think that that's something I continue to hold on to.
Absolutely.
And it's why I value my time. They're not necessarily for the actual things that I learned per se, but I think it really allowed me to grow as a person. Yeah. And a lot of that is what I rely on today, actually.
Yeah. One last thing on that, because what you say makes me remember this moment where I'm submitting my thesis. And
for your master's or your DPhil, because remember, you've got 2 degrees from that place. I only have 1.
This is the DPhil.
Okay.
Right? And Kameel, I am so done with this project. I don't care if it's good, bad, or indifferent. I said to my supervisor, like, this is what it is, and I'm giving it to you now. And she wrote back to me and said, no, you still have another level to find. And I was like, there's no way. But then I had to find that level. And like finding that thing inside you that you didn't know was there is kind of what's required of you when you're there. Yeah, probably at the bar as well. Other places.
Actually, that's very great podcast segueing skills. I think that's exactly right. And I think, as you said, because the lowest common denominator had risen quite significantly, the expectation on you was significantly higher, and it required you to dig deep. And I think that in the context of the bar, which actually Oxford and the bar are very similar in certain dynamics, at least in the context of working and being able to produce work, I feel like that feels familiar in terms of always pushing myself to, go that one step further. Because, that's really how that system is designed. It's designed as an inherently competitive war of all against all.
Sure.
And even though you're friendly with everybody, you are in very stiff competition with them, and the bar's not very different, So there is a parallel there for me, but I agree with you. And I mean, you must have obviously found that next level because you've got the crimson and purple robe.
I'm here. I survived.
Yeah,
I survived.
Yeah.
What do you have a love for the law? And if so, what about the law do you continue to find interesting?
Oh, that's actually a very difficult question for me to answer, because I always laugh at many of my colleagues and friends, and I say that they're law nerds. And the reason I say they're law nerds is because they know, the facts of cases and what happened before, and, they can tell you about this judge was dealing with this issue at this time, and I cannot do that at all.
Yeah.
So insofar as do I have a passion for law in that way, I don't think I do. I think where my passion for the law comes in is I really enjoy argument. I enjoy debate. I enjoy, rigorous engagement. And I think that the law by its nature leans into that. Yeah. And so that's where my passion for the law comes in. And, my passion for the law as well is finding the right case and deploying it, to some effect rather than simply just knowing a case and being able to recite from it. But that is what I enjoy. And I think also what I enjoy about the law in South Africa, as opposed to in England or maybe not now in the United States, given the current American administration of President Trump. But the law is quite ossified in other countries, and people forget that South Africa is a very young democracy, actually.
Yeah.
And in 1994, and then in 1996, when the new constitution came into being, we really said we're going to start afresh, and we're going to sort of find our way as we go along. And I think for me, that's what I'm also very interested in about how the law is really shaping our country, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the not so good. And the fact that I get to play a part in that on behalf of clients, obviously, I mean, not me personally, but as a mouthpiece for clients, I really enjoy that. It's nice to know that you're making some sort of contribution.
I mean, you've made many contributions already, but one that introduced you to many people in the country was, of course, when you argued the recent Phala case before the Constitutional Court.
Yeah.
I mean, still waiting for judgment on that, and I'm not gonna.
No comment.
Couldn't possibly comment.
That's what you may think. I couldn't possibly comment, Caesar.
And before we get back to the episode, we just want to let you know we have a big goal on this channel to build this community to 1,000 members. That means we have 2 new levels of SMWX membership. The first level gives you exclusive access to content, discounts on merch, but the second level, in addition to various other perks, gives you access to me. We're going to have meetups, online sessions. You're going to get discount on our live events. So if you want to deepen your SMWX community experience, help us get to that 1,000 member level. Look forward to seeing you. But I wonder, just from the perspective of your own journey, what's it like to be, up there still as a junior, but arguing a case of national importance, very high stakes. And, what was that like for you?
Well, I think I was operating on pure adrenaline by that point. I'm not sure if I had slept in the couple of days before that.
Yeah.
But, again, it's an interesting question to ask because I'm not sure that I necessarily feel anything about the case, at least for me personally. When I stand up there, it's not about what's happening around me or outside of the courtroom or whatever the case is. It's, this is our case. This is the point I have to get across. This is the argument I have to land. And that's how I focus myself. And obviously dynamics like if you're a junior arguing against three of the most senior silks in the country, that plays a role. But I try not to let that stuff get to me. And, at least in my experience, many of my silk opponents or senior opponents don't ride on that either. I enjoy it for the occasion as a opportunity to debate, test ideas, be challenged by judges, give answers, get told you're wrong, not get an opportunity to rebut, but yeah. It is what it is. So I think that's how I look at it. I mean, Phala for me was special for a couple of different reasons, though. The first one was that we were an all junior team. We were instructed by an all female team. Of the 9 lawyers in the team, 8 were people of color. And the reason I say that is because in a lot of public interest litigation, you see counsel not being necessarily very reflective of South Africa's demographics.
Absolutely.
So I think that was very important for me. And personally for me, it was 7 years to the day that I got my red bag. So that was a full circle moment,
Very cool.
That was a full circle moment for me.
And that's the bag you get given by a senior when they look at your work and say, I saw something good here. I want to acknowledge that formally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, talk about full circle moment as well. I got mine in my first year of practice for a case that came about in month 3, where on the first morning of the 2-day hearing, my leader is asked a question by Judge President Mlambo, who's now just been recommended to be the DCJ.
Oh wow, was that?
Yeah,
that
just happened.
morning?
Yeah, it just happened earlier today. But is asked a question, and my senior sits. He says, "Yes, that's a good question, but Mr. Premhid will answer that." And then I stand up, and I've been at the bar for 3 months, and I end up arguing against a silk who took silk before I was born. We lost that point, but we won the case overall. And I was acting for the Guptas at that stage, actually.
There we go.
And we won against all odds. And I think where the atmosphere was dead against us, and my leader, I think, thought that was worth a red bag. And so it's interesting for me. Interesting for me because I'm the kind of lawyer who truly believes in the cab rank rule. I act for anyone as long as they can pay my fee, and they ask me to act.
Which is rising rapidly.
Well, yes, charge by the minute, but I act for anyone who can pay my fee, engages me in an area of law in which I ordinarily practice, and if I'm available. And that means I act sometimes for the so-called good guys, and I act for the so-called bad guys. Yeah. And quite frankly, I don't give a fig. My responsibility as an officer of the court is to advance the strongest case for the client that I represent, so that the court can come to the right decision. My personal politics doesn't come into it. It shouldn't come into it. And I think too many lawyers, if they're honest, allow their personal beliefs to start tainting what briefs they take or don't take, or how they represent people, or whatever the case is.
Such an important point you raise. It's something I've certainly seen up close as well.
I'm sure.
And it's sad how still in our society there's a tendency to conflate the client with the lawyer.
Yeah.
Particularly in political matters. But I might add there are certain racial dynamics at play as well, maybe even gender dynamics, because, I mean, advocates represent lots of clients, but often, I'm sorry to say, black advocates have to bear a specific burden in terms of when they are representing clients. Even the so-called good guys or so-called bad guys, there's an identification with the client. A privilege which is often not afforded to them is that they are just conducting their professional duty. EFF one day, DA the next, one business one day, and their competitor another day later.
Well, you know, Muzi Sikakane, whom you obviously know and have interviewed, writes about this in his book, where he says that, you know, black lawyers get identified with their clients. So I, for example, get called an EFF lawyer, and that actually impacts how I get work or don't get work. People choose to brief me or not brief me because they think that, you know, because I act for the EFF, that's where my political loyalty lies. The truth of the matter is no one knows where my political loyalty lies, and that's a deliberate choice on my part. And, you know, it's unfortunate that happens because, you know, some of our white counterparts act for mining houses in the silicosis case, you know, and they act for white capital, if you want to use that, white monopoly capital, if you want to use that controversial
Let's
phrase.
Let's not get onto their criminal clients.
Well, exactly. And they don't get tarred with the brush of their client, you know, and it's interesting that still perpetuates itself. I'll never forget a senior counsel that I was arguing against the second time in a week in a different matter, said to me before the matter started, is this another one in your gallery of rogues? Which I thought was quite revealing, actually, more about the kind of cases they don't take rather than the kinds of cases that I do take. But it's an unfortunate reality that many black lawyers face. And, you know, the other irony, of course, is that a lot of black lawyers end up taking the cases that they do because that's the only work they get. You know, so they act for the state or they act for the so-called bad guys because they're not getting the lucrative work, and they're not getting the lucrative work because they're stupid. They're not getting the lucrative work because racism is systemic and endemic and continues in terms of how advocates are briefed and not briefed. And so I personally think it's actually rank hypocrisy to call a black lawyer who acts for the EFF, for example, an EFF lawyer, when it's not like a white political party or a white dominated political party is lining up to brief them, you know, and so but these kinds of double standards, I think, are the lived experiences of not only black lawyers. I think it's the lived experiences of many professionals in many sectors of the economy, where even though we have formal equality, you know, ingrained culture is very difficult to change. And sometimes actually even people of color or women can perpetuate, you know, sometimes very racist or chauvinistic cultures. And, but that's just the reality we have to contend with, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, you alluded to Justice Mlambo, and at the recent JSC interviews, there was an interesting debate which ensued between him and Tembeka Ngcukaitobi and others.
My good friend.
Indeed, who was saying, you know, what is it about legal culture that we have this constitution which in theory is supposed to overturn a lot of the conservatism that perpetuates apartheid inequality, and yet despite the fact that we have these constitutional declarations, in practice, in the legal culture, in the profession, there is still a tendency to reproduce these patterns of inequality and conservatism.
Yeah, I mean, so how I would disaggregate it is I would look at the constitutional issues, and I would say on the constitutional issues, and me being a conservative constitutional lawyer, I would say that actually the bench has gone too far to reach into the executive heartland or the legislative heartland and applying constitutional control in an inappropriate way. So on the constitutional issues, I think that very often, you know, the courts are very progressive. And for me, as I say, a bit too progressive at times.
Sure.
But I think insofar as legal culture is concerned, which I would address separately, that arises because I think it's a culture based on hierarchy. And so even though the bar is supposed to be an aristocracy of the intellect, the reality is when you're up against an eminent senior counsel, for example, the court or the judge, let's be specific, sometimes can react differently towards the senior as opposed to the junior. And that's not to say that the judge is biased, or it's not to say that the judge is not going to properly apply themselves and make a good determination. But because of how long your senior colleague might have been at the bar, that means they build up a degree of credibility that you as someone in your first year just don't have. And so that's a real example of how that culture perpetuates itself. I mean, we heard stories not too long ago from the JSC that, sometimes the judges enter and exit based on which judge was appointed first and which one came after. Wow. Or, in the US, for example, talk about a totally different country. In the US Supreme Court, the practice is that when the 9 judges are in conference, if anyone has to enter or exit the library where they are in conference, the junior judge has to wake up to open and close the door. And I mean, we're talking about, a US Supreme Court judge being made into a doorman because they're the most junior appointee, you know. So I think it's a very peculiar thing about the legal profession, that because it operates and is organized and disciplined on the principle of hierarchy, it means that power is located at the top, and therefore it's slow to change because the people who hold the most power are also the ones who are at the top of the hierarchy. So sometimes there's a disconnect, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's also, you alluded to the Constitutional Court itself and how it's made some judgments which have encroached on the separation of powers maybe too liberally. There's also a deeper debate in our country, and I'm very interested to hear your views, because the debate seems to be growing in intensity about the Constitution. On the one hand, we clearly have a Constitution whose ambition is to overturn patterns of inequality in various and myriad forms. On the other, we have a society that is clearly stagnating, to put it mildly, and failing to even approximate those constitutional ambitions. And so we have this mystery as to, we've got this wonderful constitution and a stagnating society. Do you think there's a causal relationship between society's stagnation and the constitution, maybe some deficiency in the constitution? Or do you think that it lies more in the state's failure to implement? Where do you stand on this debate about the virtues and vices of our Constitution?
So, why I think courts sometimes go too far, and that's not to say that, I'm arguing for a type of system where politicians get to act and they're never held accountable by the judiciary. I'm all for constitutional supremacy.
Right.
Where I think my debate comes in is the degree of deference that a court should play to another arm of state when that arm of state is, determining its internal processes or whatever the case is. I know some people who watched me argue Phala might think I'm now arguing against myself, but this is my individual opinion as opposed to the case I put in front of the court. But why I think that relates directly to what you are asking about is that I think courts have been dragged into the accountability gap that exists between the electorate and the electors. And so I think that, in as much as it's easy for me to say that courts have gone too far, I think what motivates courts to go far sometimes is the fact that we're operating in an accountability-free zone in circumstances where even if voters, are suffering as the consequence of how policy is implemented or not implemented or whatever the case might be, it results in people going to the court to overturn the consequence rather than, trying to get it changed where it should be, which is at the ballot box.
Yeah.
And I mean, the fact that now in South Africa, more eligible voters don't vote rather than those who do vote is an absolutely frightening thing. It means in theory that if you had a new political party, and we seem to get one a week in South Africa,
exactly.
But if a new political party suddenly emerged and caught those people's imagination, it meant that that party could effectively win power in one election, and the GNU, it creates, makes people passionate, and, some people like it or don't like it or whatever. I think, in fact, what's happening now in South Africa is we're having the ANC has lost its majority. It has to now be more accountable in ways that it hasn't had to be when it's had an substantial majority. And I think we're now at a tipping point where even if coalition politics is how we form governments moving forward, the elected officials or elected MPs can no longer take the voter for granted.
Sure.
And I think as that starts to happen more, then maybe you'll see the constitutional dream achieved, because you won't have to ask a court, sitting in their courtroom disconnected from the voters to suddenly make a decision that influences policy. The people who are supposed to make the policy are now incentivized to do it well.
Yeah.
But, I think it's easy just to blame the Constitution and say it's the fault of the Constitution or whatever. The reality is that the Constitution is a document. The courts can only take it so far. Yeah. And then it does fall to the other branches of state to deliver on the promise.
I mean, what I think is certainly fair is that if we were to score the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive, the judiciary in the last 30 odd years is far and away the branch that has, performed best. We can have all kinds of conversations about judges, how they act, and mistakes they've made, but I mean, compared to the legislature and the executive, I don't think it's close, at least in my view.
Well, considering I act both for and against the executive and the legislature all the time, I'm not going to necessarily mark them. But I think I think that reflects something as well, right? Because I think that in antithesis to apartheid, the constitutional project envisioned a kind of power that was accountable to the courts and could be subjugated by the court to the Constitution if it crossed a line. And I think it was only natural for our judiciary to really take up that mantle and to start fulfilling the role that the Constitution envisions for them. I suppose where we can, and where I think some fault lies, is perhaps the political class, however constituted, hasn't lived up to the same promise. I mean, there was a time where, the ANC as the ruling party, and I'm mentioning the ANC as the ruling party, not for it itself, but, it had a 2/3 majority once upon a time, and now it doesn't. And that's you can't blame the voter if they've changed their mind. Power is in your hands, and you have to exercise it. So, I mean, politics is not an easy game, but I think what has happened over a long period of time is politicians have, and this is across the board, if you ask me, I think they've sort of focused internally as a political class, almost to the exclusion of the voter. And I think now we're getting to see them look outward because they have to, because now power is in play. That it's really as simple as that.
Let me ask you this then. If there's one thing you think that needs to change in either our constitution or wider legal culture, what do you think that is? And if there's one thing that you think needs to be preserved and that is virtuous, what do you think that is?
So I think I would change the electoral system. I'm not necessarily sure how I would change it, in the sense that I don't know if I've necessarily made up my mind whether a constituency model is better than a mixed member model or a straight PR model. But I think that I would change the electoral system to make it, on one hand, more representative, but also potentially not overly representative in the interest of stable government. I would also borrow from the US system where at least in the Senate, 1/3 of the Senate is elected every 2 years. And I think I would implement something like that in South Africa, because that acts almost as a constant referendum on whomever the government is and how they're doing.
Sure.
So if I were to make one change, I'd probably want to change the electoral system. And for all my judge bashing and constitution bashing, actually the thing I'd keep the supremacy of the constitution.
Sure.
Because, it becomes popular every now and again where, political actors say, well, the courts are overstepping and, they're inappropriately exercising their power.
Yeah.
The truth of the matter is that the political settlement we had in 1993 or whenever it was, chose that model and clothed the judiciary with that kind of power. And I mean, I don't think we can say that the judiciary acts against, government or parliament or whatever for no reason. It obviously does so where there's a breach of rights of some kind that it can exercise. And I think that's good. And I think human beings and the experience of politics should teach us that, we should lend politicians our votes. We shouldn't necessarily have blind faith in them.
Yeah.
And why I say that is because, you could, just because you like the current lot and you say, okay, well, give them parliamentary supremacy, doesn't mean that the people who come after them are going to either be the ones that you like or they're going to use that for the greater good.
Yeah.
So, given our history and the checks and balances and things, I wouldn't change that for all my conservative criticism.
Sure. The profession itself is also facing an interesting moment where it is reckoning with what is often called transformation means right now. As far as stagnation is concerned, there's also just a general slowness in the pace of transformation in many professions, the legal profession's no exception. It may be an exemplar of how slow transformation can be. Talk us through where you think the legal profession is on transformation and some of the obstacles that still need to be overcome.
Well, I mean, I was never an attorney, so I can't really speak to that side of the profession. All I'll say is that the recent statistics that have come out, which demonstrate that I think 75% of ownership of all law firms around the country remain in predominantly white male hands.
75%.
I speak subject to correction, but I think the ownership metric says that. That illustrates the challenge. And at least I can say that at the bar, at the Johannesburg bar, on our current membership statistics, if I'm not mistaken, 66% of our silks are white men and only 3% are what you would say generically black women.
Wow. 3%.
I think it's about 3. It might actually be lower if I've done the maths correctly.
Wow.
But what that evidences is obviously that change is difficult and change is hard. And I don't think the reason change doesn't happen is because people are hostile necessarily. I mean, naturally there will be some people who are hostile, but let's give everyone the benefit of the doubt. I think that it goes back to the earlier discussion that we have, at the bar at least, if we want to see the statistics of our silk members become more representative of what the junior bar looks like, and the junior bar by comparison is overwhelmingly black and overwhelmingly female, we have to create a value chain throughput so that those young black baby juniors, as we call them at the bar, black women in particular, don't drop out in the first 5 years, in the first 10 years. And also that they don't necessarily go to the bench. They continue as senior advocates. But for us to do that, we need access to work. And you need access not just to any work, you need access to good quality work. And the challenge in transformation is that, unfortunately, human biases are what they are. And so often, you as a person of color have to work 3 times as hard to be judged as equal to someone else who's white, who doesn't have to work as hard, because the attorney will look at the two of you and judge the white colleague automatically as being more qualified or better than you are. And that's just the reality of what we face. And I mean, maybe it's a bit of a risk for me to say this publicly in the way that I am, but we must call it out for what it is.
Absolutely.
And the late Eusebius Makaiser, whom we both know and are very fond of, had a discussion once about this, and he coined the phrase competence racism. Let me give you a quick story, if I may. In the same week that as a junior counsel, I was briefed by the Minister of Finance to argue against the EFF over the fuel duty.
Yeah.
And the Minister of Finance doesn't ordinarily brief junior counsel, so I was very grateful to get that brief. And we won, much to the EFF's chagrin.
Absolutely.
But be that as it may. Absolutely. Cab rank all the time.
Yeah.
I met someone for the first time and in the professional context, and they didn't necessarily view me as capable or competent, even though other people were telling this person that I was capable and competent. And it was only when the white senior counsel endorsed me as someone of merit, did the attitude change slightly. Subsequently, in the matter that I'm talking about, we won. That obviously flipped attitudes, but it illustrates the point, I think, which is that the starting line for some of us is very different to others, and that we have to, sometimes you just have to work 2 times as hard to come up to base, rather than get ahead. And so these are the kinds of challenges that we face. I mean, I don't know how you change that. At least for me personally, even though I'm a junior counsel, I try to bring in other juniors all the time, and nowadays I try not to take work where I don't have a junior counsel, and more often than not, the junior counsel I bring in are, people of color and women, and, because that's something practical that I can do. And I'm more for practical change rather than just having philosophical debates all the time.
You underwent quite an interesting personal political transformation, where I would say, would it be fair to say that you were in some ways partial to I won't say the DA, but a DA worldview?
That's an interesting way of putting it.
And over time have evolved away from that. And this fascinates me because when I met you and I knew you, I was like, this is the arch DA person.
Yeah, in some ways, I was the arch DA person.
Yeah. And then, over time, as I watched you from afar, I would read some of your public comments, and I was like, "Whoa,
this is not the same Kameel."
Talk us through that.
Well, I mean, politics being what it is, my grouping, shall I say, eventually ended up outside the DA. The likes of Lindiwe Mazibuko, Mbali and Thuli, Makashule Ghana. Those are the people I identified with. And so just from a political level, and that's the nature of the game, right? I'm not saying that we needed to be treated any special way. Yeah, politics is a blood sport. And if you want to play, you have to be prepared to take the blows as well as land them. So, that practically started that transition. And actually Oxford gave me the distance to be able to look back at what used to be my own political party somewhat critically in a way that I wouldn't have been able to do so if I was still here. And I think where my disagreement with the DA comes from is that it's my broader criticism perhaps about a particular type of white liberal in South Africa. And it's unfortunate because actually I identify as a liberal, but liberal in South Africa has become a dirty word.
Sure.
And if you identify as a liberal, certain terrible assumptions are made about you. And I think that unfortunately a lot of white liberals, particularly in the DA, don't do true liberals, any favors. And the only topic I would identify that I think the DA still struggles with is its ability to commit itself to formal equality, whilst at the same time understanding the race reality of where we live in South Africa and why redress is important and why something like affirmative action or black economic empowerment has a legitimate role to play. And, the arguments usually made against it is, oh, it's just corruption and whatever. Yeah, sure. Any system's going to have corruption. Any system's going to have difficulties. But it's about the willingness, I think, to embrace that as a reality. Which is where I think my own thinking and development came from. And, my personal experience as well in my life, I think assimilation was something that I excelled at.
Sure.
I think it's the Faustian pact that many people of color have to make. And I think why I'm more able now to be more of myself, or be more comfortable with myself regardless of the pressure to assimilate, is because I've established myself to some extent.
Certainly.
So that has helped, that's been part of my transition. But also I came to realize that, I won't name names, but, when I was at the very junior stage of my career and trying to, take membership at groups or whatever, you get told, we want someone who has an Oxford degree and, has this kind of inclination in terms of practice and whatever. And you have all of those things, and then and then results speak for themselves.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, it's confronting that duality about often I think white liberals in how they approach interracial dynamics in particular, that I think for me was a point of departure where I had to say thank you and goodbye. And actually it was the real camel that, the straw that broke the camel's back, should we say, is actually when Helen Zille, whom at a time I was very loyal to, decided to vacate the party leadership and hand it over to Ramphele, purely because she was black, as the overarching narrative.
Sure.
And I mean, not only is that a betrayal of like liberal values, it's also fundamentally problematic to just think that, black voters are going to vote for you now because you've just changed the face of the party,
Yeah.
But these are the contradictions we live amidst.
No, indeed. And we have a lot of lawyers, aspiring lawyers, watching the channel. And I mean, your ability to establish yourself at the bar has been nothing short of spectacular. What advice would you give to those who are considering a life at the bar, in terms of the early years of, let's say, pupillage and baby juniorship, going forward?
Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to plug my LinkedIn profile.
By all means.
Because what I've done in all seriousness is I've written a series of 8 articles that I've given the title of Pupillage Unpacked. And I've attempted to write 8 brutally honest mini essays about what to expect with pupillage.
Very cool.
And your junior, your initial steps as a baby junior lawyer and what to prepare yourself for. I think for me, and I say this with the benefit of hindsight, and the hindsight is always 20/20 vision. And I say this also acknowledging the fact that I don't think I necessarily possessed all of these skills when I started. And in fact, I wish I did. But experience has taught me that there are at least 3 things that you need to navigate the bar. Maybe navigate any profession, but navigate the bar in particular, because it's not an employment relationship and you're in a war of all against all from the moment you start, And the one is emotional awareness and insight.
Underappreciated.
Absolutely. And I'm not saying that, at the very least, try and develop that for yourself. Sure. Because pupillage and the bar will test you, and you need to have an emotional hinterland and a reserve to draw on to keep you going when you're tested in ways that, might even feel like they can break you. And so I would say emotional awareness and insight is important. I would also say radical acceptance. I think when I started out at the bar, I wanted to like change everything, and I wanted to pull structures down, and I wanted to burn everything, Hopefully my colleagues aren't watching this, but I wanted to do that kind of thing. And through bitter experience, I had to just realize that, there will be a time and a place where my voice will count for more. And there will be a time and a place when I know more. And so I think that humility is very important. And also humility in the sense of, you mentioned Tembeka earlier, and Tembeka is probably the greatest advocate of our generation. But, many people look at Tembeka on television and think, I can be like Tembeka. I can argue, or I can do that. It all looks so easy. But, they don't know the hours that he puts in to get to that point. They don't know, the years of graft that he's put in order to get there. And I think, and why I say humility is because I think there's a misperception as to what the bar is about. Some people think it's all about being on TV and in these cases and whatever. The reality is that most of the legal work that happens, meaningful legal work, no one knows about. And it's not because it's done in secret. It's just because, there aren't TV cameras there and they're very skilled people doing it. And so I think the humility is important because your ego is the thing that can undermine you. Yeah. But those are soft skills. The one hard skill I would say is to learn to read critically and for meaning, and also be able to write well, and write in a way that is designed to persuade without being shouty, if I can say that. And also then trying to develop the ability to articulate yourself. And I admit that, I'm a first language English speaker. Most of the law is conducted in English. So I accept the advantage that brings me. And we must accept that other people will struggle. For no other reason other than education disparities and all these kinds of things. But to be able, it's not even about what you sound like. It's about the ability to conceptualize ideas in a way that is easy to understand and can be conveyed in a way that a judge will be persuaded by, but actually that a lay person could be persuaded by, not only persuaded by, but could follow you in the argument. Because, some people think law is all about this, because we wear these funny clothes, these funny robes, and we say funny words sometimes, that it's all like magic and Hogwarts and whatever. I mean, it feels like that when I'm, floating about in the corridor and my cloak is billowing behind me. But actually, it's just about having a structured conversation with someone where you're using a particular method of thinking, analyzing, and articulating to convey for the purpose of persuasion. And I think if you can develop those hard skills with those soft skills, you probably will succeed. You will probably thrive, in fact.
One thing that interests me, I was actually recently interviewing our mutual friend, Edwin Cameron.
Yes.
And
dear judge.
Indeed. And in his new book, written with two co-authors, Suhaila and Rebecca.
Yes.
He actually delivers this anecdote that I'd never heard before, where he was dressed down by Judge or Justice Elof or someone. And I'm like, what? Edwin Cameron in court was like, it was quite a humiliating moment. And you realize that everyone goes through these courtroom humiliations. Maybe that's too strong a word. But I also think that there is quite a lot of toxicity in the advocate-judge relationship that we have not unpacked fully. But how do you grapple with that? Because no matter how good you are, there is going to come a moment when you're in court and you're like, oh my goodness, this judge is now just like, is not buying my story. And recovering from that must be quite difficult.
Well, let me choose my words very carefully.
Indeed,
because
and we won't mention any
no,
particular
I'm not going to
judicial
mention
officers
any judges from
in any
down in the
divisions.
Western Cape or with TV programs or anything.
No.
But and I won't, because I did get admonished for my behavior. But I think that let's speak plainly. That's a good example.
Yeah.
In the first instance, the advocate's job is to persuade, right? So no matter what you're dealing with, the true trick, and this is where I would criticize myself actually for sometimes, getting a little bit hot under the collar or maybe a bit snippy or whatever.
Sure, but we don't talk about how easy it can be.
Sure.
The stakes are high. You may be representing a client, but in that moment, it matters.
Yeah, well,
It matters
because
to
you're
you,
the
right?
interlocutor, right?
Yeah.
So the judge might be criticizing the client, but you as the mouthpiece of the client is the one who has to wear the criticism. So you have to persuade. So if you're doing something or reacting in a way that is actually detrimental to your ability to persuade, then actually you're failing at the first step.
Sure.
And for me personally, when I think about myself as a practitioner, I'm always pushing myself. And actually one of my recent pupils, whom I won't name because then all the other 5 of them will fight with me and say I didn't drop their name on the podcast either.
Yeah.
But he said to me, he has observed a particular tendency of mine when I'm in court, and depending on the level of engagement that I can become, in his words, a little bit snippy with either my opponent or a judge or whatever. And that's natural because, as I was saying, it's a structured conversation. So it's only natural that the other person in the conversation reacts in a particular way and you do as well. But if snippiness is something I have to be aware of, then I need to counteract that because it can redound badly in my favor or not in my favor, because it will make the judge not favorably disposed to me. So in the first instance, you have to almost have a sort of superhuman level of calm and control. And many of my colleagues have this, because you have to just depersonalize what's happening to the extent that you maintain your ability to continue, even if it's obvious that the judge is not interested in what you have to say, but to continue engaging in a way that puts the point across. I think, but we are all human at the end of the day. And I think that sometimes some engagements can leave a bitter taste in the mouth. They can come across very poorly. Me personally, I've never had one of those. I've had robust engagements. I've had engagements where I've been made to work very hard by judges, that one as well. And, it might come across differently if you're observing it, but in the room, it never reaches a point of confrontation or whatever. But unfortunately, as an advocate, you have to develop a thick skin, and you just have to be able to keep going, no matter what the people commenting on YouTube say about you, or on X, or anywhere else.
Everywhere in our country, there are legal experts who flood social media platforms with their own analysis of a case, and it's an interesting moment to be a high-profile lawyer, because that's a new development in some ways. Just the extent of the noise and the sheer intensity of the opinion around cases.
Yeah, well, firstly, I don't know I'd necessarily call myself high profile, but I know this will sound as if I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth. But I think that in as much as televising court proceedings is very important for the open justice principle, I also think that televising court proceedings has really changed the dynamic sometimes of how cases are engaged in, and how not only inside the courtroom, but also outside the courtroom.
Interesting.
And we started speaking earlier about, when some lawyers are identified with their clients, some of my colleagues, your father in particular, whom I'm very fond of, suffers the most appalling abuse. And your father, anyone, who practices the law would be willing to accept criticism. Legitimate criticism is something we have to all live with. But the extent to which some of the abuse goes is absolutely incredible. I made the mistake after Phala of opening up my Twitter and then just seeing the stream of engagements. And some of that was very pleasant and sweet.
Sure.
Some of that was very clear that if I then switched sides, so to speak, that they would no longer be impressed with me. And some of it was just downright abusive, you know. I mean, some of it was homophobic and some of it was, you know, racist. And, you know, no one needs to deal with that. So, I mean, you know, it's very important that people see what happens in courtrooms because that's part of the legitimacy, so that when judges make controversial decisions, people don't think that, you know, this happens in secret. They get to see the decision or they see the decision being communicated, but they also see how, you know, we get there. I think that's very important. But, you know, you want people to exercise tolerance. I don't think you'll always get that.
Yeah. Sadly not. Kameel, we're coming to the end of our time, and as you mentioned, you bill by the microsecond. The fees will be linked down below, and people can observe them at their own peril.
Yes.
But what's the plan for the future? You know, you're nearly 10 years into your time at the bar.
Nearly 10 years.
Which is amazing to think. I don't know how we've got this old so
I know.
fast, by the way.
It's horrific.
Yeah. Where to from here? There are various scenarios. There are many people in your position who have left the bar and gone on to other things. There are people who have stayed in the bar and become senior counsel, gone into the judiciary. There are people who have gone into politics. Have you thought about where you see your future going from this point?
Well, for me personally, I don't think I would become a judge. I think I have completely the wrong temperament for it. I think, in fact, I would be that judge who shouts at counsel and doesn't listen to them because they've got firm views. And I say that because I enjoy the fight, if I can say that. And I don't necessarily know that I will ever not enjoy the fight. So what that leaves for me for the future is that I hope to continue at the bar, and I hope to, you know, I hope to be that advocate who's been at the bar for 50 years or longer. It's important actually that we have that pedigree of lawyer in the country, so that when issues come up that no one has dealt with before, there are people who have the reserve of knowledge to give firm advice for or against one way or another. And I'd like to hopefully be a person of that kind of substance. And I don't think I would go anywhere else. The only other place I would consider going to is I would consider doing something in the public service, or broadly speaking in the public service, but I'm not sure what that would look like. I mean, could I be a civil servant? I don't know. Could I be a cabinet minister? Maybe. You know, they can get my phone number if they want to offer me a seat. But exactly. But no, you know, should that never happen, you know, being my boyhood dream of maybe one day going into politics, which is perfectly all right. For me, I think my service and contribution will be camping out at the bar for the next while, and hopefully, you know, navigating different matters, mentoring people who come behind me, providing opportunities for clients to articulate their agenda. I hope that will be my legacy 50 years or more from now, as contributing to South Africa in that way. But really all I'm thinking about now is dinner.
Well, I would have thought that the road to senior counsel is fairly clear for you, and it's a question of when. But I mean, it's 10 years now. I know it's usually in and around, or maybe 12 or 13 or 14, or sometimes a bit less, but surely people would be thinking of you in that light now, given what you've achieved so far.
Yes. No. You know, obviously, being an advocate, the only promotion we have is from junior to senior. I believe in the institution of silk, so it would be foolish of me to pretend that that isn't an ambition of mine.
Sure.
But, on one hand, people might think that because of the type of cases that I argue or I'm lucky enough to be involved in, that means I should do it immediately. There are others who think that I have to wait for a while. I think the thing for me personally is that I will do it when it comes, and when it's the right time for me to do so. And, it is also, people might not know this, but how it works nowadays is that you put your name up and you get ranked by all your colleagues at the bar who have a public comment feedback sort of session. And that gets aggregated. You go before a committee of silks who interview you and they recommend. And then from the bar, it goes to the LPC and then the minister and the president who ultimately signs. But you put yourself, in the hands of your colleagues. And that requires emotional reserve because your colleagues will, as a method of ensuring quality, be very rigorous in their assessment.
Yeah.
And, you have to be able to withstand that. And you've got to be able to take whatever comes your way. So we'll see. One person has sort of tapped on my shoulder at this point, but that's best left unsaid, I think.
Well, it's a matter of time. And
that's kind. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. It's been wonderful.
This has been wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Picking your brain on all sorts of issues, and all the best for the future. And thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you. Like, share, subscribe. Help us reach 250,000 subscribers. Comment down below with your thoughts, your views on the Constitution, the legal profession. Are you an aspiring legal practitioner? Let us know down in the comments below. And make sure, above all, that you keep it locked on SMWX. Aye.